In the year 356 BC, in the northern Greek kingdom of Macedon, the ancient world was alive with signs and omens. On a single night, two events unfolded hundreds of miles apart. In Macedon, a queen gave birth to a son. Far away in Ephesus, the great temple of Artemis, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, burned to the ground. To us, this is a coincidence, but to the people of the time, it was destiny announcing itself. The biographer Plutarch later wrote that the goddess Artemis must have been absent from her temple because she was busy attending the birth of Alexander. This child, Alexander, was not born into an empire. Macedon wasn't even considered fully Greek by the proud city-states of Athens and Sparta. It was a rugged borderland kingdom, a place hardened by constant tribal warfare, political assassination, and the ever-present threat of invasion. Here, power was never just inherited peacefully. It was seized, defended, and often lost in a torrent of violence. Alexander was born directly into this brutal reality. His father was King Philip II, one of the most formidable and dangerous men of his age. Philip hadn't been handed a strong kingdom. He forged one himself through relentless reform, military innovation, and constant war. As a young man, he had been a political hostage in the Greek city of Thebes. He returned not just with his freedom, but with a deep understanding of Greek military science that far surpassed his rivals. Philip transformed the Macedonian army from a disorganized militia into a professional, lethal force. He introduced the sarissa, a terrifying pike over 20 feet long that kept enemies at a distance. He instituted permanent training and discipline, creating soldiers who lived and breathed warfare, and he mastered the art of combined arms, coordinating his infantry and cavalry with devastating precision. The historian Robin Lane Fox described Philip as the man who turned Macedonia from a fragile kingdom into the most efficient killing machine in Greece. Alexander didn't just hear stories about war. He grew up inside its machinery, watching his father build this incredible force. He saw firsthand what it took to command loyalty and project power. But if Philip shaped Alexander's body and his understanding of war, his mother, Olympias, shaped his mind and his soul. Olympias was not from Macedon. She came from Epirus, a land steeped in ancient mysticism and religious ecstasy. She was a devout follower of the Orphic and Dionysian cults, which practiced rituals involving divine possession, prophetic visions, and the idea of spiritual rebirth. Ancient writers tell us she handled snakes during these ceremonies and cultivated a belief in her own divine connections. According to Plutarch, she told a young Alexander a secret, that his true father was not Philip, but the king of the gods himself, Zeus. She filled his imagination with the idea that he was of divine origin. Now, this wasn't just a mother's fantasy. It was a calculated political strategy in a court where daggers were always hidden, and a king's legitimacy was constantly under threat. Divinity was the ultimate armor. If Alexander truly believed he was more than human, he would act like it. And more importantly, if others believed it too, they would follow him to the ends of the earth. From a very young age, Alexander showed an unusual intensity. He wasn't a large child, but he was restless, fiercely competitive, and possessed a piercing intelligence. His tutors found him impatient with simple repetition. He was obsessed with the heroes of old, especially the legendary warrior Achilles from Homer's Iliad. One famous story, told by multiple ancient writers, perfectly illustrates how early Alexander understood the nature of power. A magnificent but wild horse named Bucephalus was brought before King Philip. The horse was untamable, bucking and screaming, throwing every grown man who dared approach it. But Alexander, just a boy, noticed something everyone else had missed. The horse wasn't just wild. It was terrified of its own shadow dancing on the ground. Quietly, Alexander walked over, gently turned Bucephalus to face the sun so its shadow fell behind it, and then swung himself onto its back. He rode the horse with ease. Seeing this, Philip was said to have told him, "My son, seek out a kingdom equal to yourself. Macedon is too small for you." Whether those were his exact words or not, the message was embedded in Alexander's mind. Limitation was a form of failure. When Alexander turned 13, Philip made one of his most strategic investments in his son's future. He hired the greatest mind of the age to be his personal tutor, the philosopher Aristotle. This wasn't a standard education. It was a masterclass in how to rule the world. Aristotle taught Alexander philosophy and ethics, medicine and biology, and the geography of the known world. He instilled in him a deep appreciation for Homeric literature and the ideals of Greek identity. Crucially, Aristotle also taught Alexander how Greeks viewed non-Greeks, whom they called barbarians. Aristotle argued that Greeks were naturally suited to rule, while others were suited to be ruled, but he also taught Alexander to study and understand foreign cultures, not just dismiss them. This fundamental contradiction would later define Alexander's entire reign. He didn't just want to conquer the East. He wanted to understand it, absorb it, and ultimately rule it as part of a new, blended world. Throughout all his future campaigns, Alexander carried a copy of the Iliad, specially annotated for him by Aristotle. For Alexander, Achilles wasn't just a character in a story. He was a blueprint for how to live, how to fight, and how to die a glorious death. Alexander's training wasn't just theoretical. At 16, while his father was away on a military campaign, Philip left him in charge as regent of Macedon. Almost immediately, a northern tribe saw an opportunity and rebelled. Alexander didn't wait for instructions. He didn't hesitate. He marshaled his forces, crushed the uprising, and founded a new city on the spot, naming it Alexandropolis. The message to Macedon and its enemies was crystal clear. The king's son ruled with the same iron will as the king himself. 2 years later, at the age of 18, Alexander received his true baptism by fire. He rode with the elite Macedonian cavalry at the Battle of Chaeronea, where Philip faced the combined armies of Athens and Thebes in a fight for the future of Greece. Ancient sources tell us it was Alexander who led the decisive charge that shattered the Theban sacred band, an elite unit of 300 soldiers previously thought to be invincible. This wasn't some symbolic role for the prince. This was a battlefield initiation at the highest level, and he had proven himself a warrior and a leader. Then, in 336 BC, the world of Macedon was thrown into chaos. During a lavish public festival, King Philip was stabbed and killed by one of his own bodyguards. The motives are still debated by historians to this day. Was it a personal grudge? A political conspiracy? Was his own wife, Olympias, involved? We may never know for sure, but what happened next is what truly matters. In the chaotic days following the assassination, the 20-year-old Alexander moved with chilling speed and decisiveness. He eliminated his rivals. Any potential claimants to the throne were executed. His enemies were silenced. He secured the loyalty of the army and solidified his power. The ancient historian Justin wrote, Alexander ascended the throne with blood already on his hands, yet with the loyalty of the army intact. So by the time he became king, Alexander had been told he was divine, trained to be a killer, educated to be a ruler, and conditioned to believe that retreat was never an option. Modern scholars often debate whether Alexander truly believed in his own destiny or if he just used it as a brilliant strategic tool. The answer is likely both. As historian Ian Worthington concludes, Alexander was not born great. He was constructed by parents, teachers, and circumstance into someone who believed greatness was his only option. For him, failure was not an outcome he could even recognize. Across Greece, the old city-states watched nervously. A young, untested king now sat on a fragile throne, surrounded by enemies. He held the loyalty of the world's deadliest army, but it was an army that had yet to see him lead as its ultimate commander. The question was no longer who Alexander was. The question was what he would do next. The world was about to learn the terrible cost of underestimating him. Thanks for watching. If you want to see what happens next in Alexander's incredible story, Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next video. Alexander did not inherit a kingdom, he inherited a crisis. When Philip II was murdered in 336 BC, the shock rippled through the Greek world like an earthquake. Macedon's power had been built on Philip's personality, his alliances, his intimidation, his reputation. Remove the man, and the structure looked fragile. Alexander was 20 years old. To many Greek observers, he was not a king. He was an interruption. Ancient historian Diodorus Siculus describes the moment bluntly. The cities of Greece, believing the change of rulers offered them freedom, began to plot revolt. They had seen this before. Young rulers rarely survived. Macedonian kings were often killed by their own nobles. Greece smelled opportunity. Alexander faced three immediate threats: internal rivals within the Macedonian court, northern tribes sensing weakness, Greek city-states eager to break free. The throne he sat on was surrounded by knives. Within days of Philip's death, Alexander moved with surgical speed. Possible claimants, men with royal blood or political backing, were eliminated. This was not cruelty. It was survival. Historian Ian Worthington writes, "In Macedon, hesitation meant death. Alexander understood this instinctively, but securing Macedon was only the beginning. Greece was watching. Greece remembers Persian fire. To understand why Greece mattered so deeply, one must remember an older wound. Nearly 150 years earlier, Persian armies under Xerxes had burned Athens. Temples were destroyed, cities humiliated. Though Persia had eventually withdrawn, the memory of that invasion remained central to Greek identity. Philip had planned to exploit this memory. He proposed a pan-Hellenic crusade against Persia, revenge disguised as unity. Now Alexander inherited that plan. But first, he had to prove he was worthy to lead it. Before turning south, Alexander marched north. Illyrian and Thracian tribes, believing Macedon leaderless, rose in rebellion. These were not symbolic enemies, they were hardened warriors who had killed Macedonian kings before. Alexander crushed them with speed and brutality. According to Arrian, he marched against the barbarians with an energy beyond his years, defeating them not merely by strength but by terror. Entire tribes were annihilated. Survivors fled. The message was unmistakable. The boy king was more dangerous than the man he replaced. Only after securing his rear did Alexander turn toward Greece. Among all Greek cities, Thebes was the most dangerous. It had defeated Sparta in living memory. It had once crushed Athens, and it despised Macedonian rule. When rumors spread that Alexander had been killed in the north, Thebes revolted. This was not spontaneous. Persian agents encouraged rebellion, hoping to destabilize Macedon before the invasion of Asia. Athens hesitated. Sparta waited. Thebes acted. Alexander did not send envoys. He marched from Macedon to Thebes, over 300 miles, in less than 2 weeks. Arrian records that the Thebans were stunned. Alexander appeared before the city sooner than anyone believed possible. The psychological impact was devastating. Speed itself became a weapon. Thebes refused to surrender. Alexander offered terms. They rejected them. What followed would define his reputation forever. The battle was brief. Macedonian forces broke through Theban defenses. Street fighting followed. Then came the order that echoed across Greece. Thebes was destroyed. Men were killed. Women and children were sold into slavery. The city was erased from the map. Only temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared. Diodorus writes, more than 6,000 were slain and 30,000 were sold as slaves. This was not rage, it was calculated terror. Modern historian Robin Lane Fox explains, Alexander chose Thebes not out of hatred but necessity. One city had to die so the others would live. When news reached Athens, the political debate ended instantly. Speeches stopped, resistance collapsed. Athens sent envoys, apologized, and surrendered its leaders. Alexander, playing the role of magnanimous victor, accepted. This was deliberate. Fear had done its work. Mercy now reinforced loyalty. Sparta alone refused to submit but wisely did not fight. They would later say, "If Alexander were a god, we would obey him." They stayed out of his way. Here, Alexander revealed something crucial. He could be merciless and merciful in the same breath. The destruction of Thebes was absolute. The forgiveness of Athens was strategic. This was not emotional violence. It was statecraft through shock. Alexander summoned the Greek cities to Corinth. There he was reaffirmed as hegemon supreme, commander of the Greek forces just as Philip had been. Officially, Greece was united. Unofficially, it was occupied. Alexander promised revenge against Persia. Greece would provide ships, troops, and legitimacy. But the lesson was clear. This was not an alliance of equals. It was obedience enforced by memory. Alexander learned something essential in Greece. Power did not require love. It required certainty. The Greeks now believed three things. Alexander acted faster than anyone expected. He punished resistance absolutely. He rewarded submission generously. Historian Paul Cartledge summarizes, "By destroying Thebes, Alexander conquered Greece without fighting Greece. The cost was moral. The gain was absolute control." By 334 BC, Greece was quiet, not peaceful, silent. Alexander stood unchallenged, holding the most disciplined army in the world, the resources of Greece, the legitimacy of a Panhellenic, cause the boy king was gone. In his place stood a ruler who had already destroyed a great city. Alexander now turned east. Across the sea lay the Persian Empire, vast, wealthy, confident, and utterly unprepared for what was coming. Greece had been the test. Asia would be the proof. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander stood at the boundary between myth and reality. Before him lay the Hellespont, the narrow stretch of water separating Europe from Asia. To the modern eye, it was a geographic feature. To the ancient world, it was a symbolic threshold, the line between the familiar Greek world and the vast, unknowable East. No Macedonian king had ever crossed it with the intent Alexander carried. This was not a raid. It was an invasion of history's greatest empire. Alexander did not arrive at the Hellespont alone. He arrived carrying expectations, his father's ambition, Greece's desire for revenge, and his own cultivated belief in destiny. Philip too had planned this invasion carefully. He had mapped routes, secured alliances, and laid political groundwork across Greece. Alexander inherited the plan, but he would execute it in his own way. Ancient historian Arrian notes, Alexander did not begin the war as an adventurer, but as the lawful commander of all the Greeks. This distinction mattered. Alexander presented himself not as a conqueror, but as avenger and liberator. Alexander crossed the Hellespont first. He did not wait for his army. According to tradition, he threw a spear into Asian soil and declared the land won by the spear. Whether literal or symbolic, the message was clear. This was no negotiated war. He then traveled to Troy. There, Alexander honored the tomb of Achilles, his lifelong hero. He ran naked around the grave, following Homeric ritual, while his companion Hephaestion honored Patroclus. Plutarch records, Alexander pronounced Achilles happy in having a faithful friend while living, and when dead, a great poet to proclaim his deeds. Alexander was not simply reenacting history, he was inserting himself into it. Alexander's army numbered roughly 35,000 to 40,000 men, small by Persian standards, but unmatched in discipline. It consisted of Macedonian phalanx infantry, elite companion cavalry, Greek allied forces, specialized engineers, and scouts. They were professionals, paid, trained, and loyal not to a city but to Alexander himself. Modern historian Donald Ingalls emphasizes, logistics, not numbers, made Alexander's army deadly. He could move faster and strike harder than any Persian force. Speed would become his signature. The Persian Empire stretched from the Aegean Sea to India. It was wealthy, ancient, and deeply confident in its power. To the Persian satraps of Asia Minor, Alexander's invasion appeared familiar. Greek mercenaries had raided Persian territory before. They expected the same. They were wrong. Instead of withdrawing or negotiating, Persian commanders chose to confront Alexander at the Granicus River. This decision would haunt them. The Granicus River was not an ideal battlefield for the Macedonians. The river banks were steep. Persian cavalry waited on higher ground. Greek mercenaries held the rear. Alexander attacked anyway. Ancient sources unanimously agree. Alexander led the charge himself. Arrian writes, Alexander was the first to cross the river, conspicuous by his shield and armor. This was not symbolic leadership. This was exposure to death. Alexander was struck. His helmet was split. A Persian noble raised his sword to kill him until Clitus the Black struck the attacker down at the last moment. Alexander survived by inches. The Macedonian cavalry broke through. The phalanx followed. The Persians fled. For a moment, history nearly ended. Had Alexander fallen at the Granicus, the invasion would have collapsed instantly. There was no second in command with his authority or charisma. Modern scholars often pause here. Historian Peter Green notes, Alexander's recklessness bordered on suicidal. His survival owed as much to chance as to skill. Yet to Alexander's followers, this near-death moment reinforced something dangerous. He was protected by fate. After Granicus, the psychological balance shifted. Persian cities began surrendering without resistance. Greek cities in Asia Minor opened their gates. Persian naval bases fell. Alexander presented himself as a liberator, restoring democracies and expelling Persian officials. In practice, he replaced them with Macedonian governors, loyal only to him. This dual strategy, freedom in language, control in reality, proved devastatingly effective. Historian Paul Cartledge writes, Alexander conquered Asia Minor as much by persuasion as by arms, but persuasion backed by the memory of Granicus. News of the defeat reached King Darius III slowly, but the message was unmistakable. This was not a rebellion. This was a war. Darius began assembling a massive imperial army. Unlike the satraps, he would not underestimate the Macedonian king. But time worked against Persia. Every city that fell strengthened Alexander's supply lines. Legitimacy and confidence. Psychological escalation. The myth begins to form by the end of 334 BC. Alexander had achieved something extraordinary. He had defeated Persian forces in open battle, secured Asia Minor, proven his army could operate deep in enemy territory. More importantly, a myth was forming. The king who charged first, the king who survived. Impossible odds. The king destiny would not let die. Ancient historian Curtius Rufus reflects, the soldiers believed Alexander was guided by divine favor, and this belief made them fearless. Belief became a weapon. The invasion was no longer abstract. Alexander was no longer fighting satraps. He was drawing the attention of the great king himself. Darius would meet him not as administrator, but as ruler defending the heart of his empire. The confrontation was inevitable as Alexander marched south along the coast, securing ports and supply routes. Persian scouts carried word eastward. The King of Kings was coming, and for the first time in generations, Persia faced an enemy who did not fear it. By the autumn of 333 BC, the war had changed shape. What began as a daring invasion had become something far more dangerous, a challenge to the Persian throne itself. For the first time, Darius III, King of Kings, ruler of the largest empire on earth, personally took command. This was no symbolic gesture. In Persian political culture, the presence of the great king meant only one thing. The empire itself was at stake. Ancient historian Arrian notes, Darius gathered a force such as no Persian king had led since Xerxes. Alexander, still advancing along the eastern Mediterranean coast, now faced an enemy whose authority was absolute and whose defeat would shake the world. Darius III was not a weak ruler, but he was an uncertain one. He had come to power after palace coups and assassinations. His legitimacy rested on survival, not lineage. Unlike Alexander, he had not been raised to command from youth. Modern historian Pierre Bryant the leading authority on Achaemenid Persia, writes, Darius was a capable administrator, but not a charismatic war leader in the Macedonian sense. This difference would prove fatal. Where Alexander embodied momentum, Darius embodied caution. Two armies, two philosophies. Darius assembled an enormous force. Estimates range wildly, but modern historians agree it vastly outnumbered Alexander's army. His troops included Persian infantry, cavalry from across the empire, Greek mercenaries, royal guards, members of the royal court itself. This was not merely an army, it was a moving symbol of imperial power. Alexander's force, by contrast, remained compact, disciplined, and mobile. His men had marched, fought, and survived together. Their loyalty was personal. Historian Donald Engels observes, Alexander's army functioned like a single organism. Darius's army was a collection of peoples. Unity would matter more than numbers. The meeting occurred near the town of Issus, on a narrow strip of land between the mountains and the sea. Ironically, it was Darius who chose this battlefield, either by miscalculation or poor intelligence. The narrow terrain neutralized Persian numerical superiority. Arrian comments dryly, Darius chose a place where his numbers did him no good. Geography once again favored Alexander. On the eve of the battle, the contrast between the two leaders could not have been sharper. Darius slept amid luxury, surrounded by court officials and guards. Alexander slept among his soldiers. According to Plutarch, when Parmenion urged a night attack, Alexander replied that he would not steal victory. This was not arrogance, it was theater. Alexander wanted the battle fought in daylight, where all could see who prevailed. At dawn, the two armies faced each other. Alexander positioned himself on the right wing, commanding the companion cavalry. Darius stood at the center, elevated on his royal chariot, visible to all. The battle opened with brutal intensity. Persian forces attacked aggressively, attempting to overwhelm the Macedonian left. For a moment, the situation grew dangerous. Then Alexander struck. He drove his cavalry forward at an angle not toward the army, but toward Darius himself. This was not standard warfare. This was assassination by battlefield. The moment everything broke, Alexander's charge cut through Persian lines. He was wounded in the thigh. His men fell around him, but the momentum did not stop. As Alexander approached, Darius did something no Persian king was expected to do. He turned his chariot. He fled. Ancient sources emphasize this moment relentlessly. Arrian writes, when Darius saw his line broken, fear seized him, and he was the first to flee. This single act shattered the Persian army's morale. The great king's flight meant divine favor had shifted. The army collapsed in the chaos of retreat. Something extraordinary happened. Darius abandoned his mother, wife, and children, along with royal treasure. When Alexander entered Darius's tent, he found the Persian royal family weeping, believing the king dead. Alexander did not harm them. According to Plutarch, he treated them with the respect due to royalty, not captives. This moment shocked the ancient world. Alexander could be merciless, but he could also perform mercy with precision. It was propaganda of the highest order. Issus was not merely a military defeat. It was a symbolic catastrophe for Persia. The great king had fled before a foreign invader. Historian Peter Green explains, after Issus, Darius was no longer feared. Alexander was. The psychological balance of the war reversed completely. From this moment on, Alexander was not fighting Persia's strength. He was exploiting its doubt. In the aftermath, Darius sent letters to Alexander offering friendship, ransom for his family, recognition of territory already conquered. Alexander rejected them all. Arrian records his response, the world cannot have two sons. This was no longer negotiation, it was succession. After Issus, Alexander stopped presenting himself as avenger of Greece. He began acting as successor to Persian kingship. He wore Persian symbols. He accepted Persian submission. He ruled conquered lands as if they already belonged to him. Issus transformed Alexander's war. It was no longer about conquest. It was about replacement. Darius fled east to raise another army. Alexander turned south. Between him and the heart of Persia stood fortified cities, ancient ports, and one island stronghold that refused to kneel. What happens after you win the biggest battle of your life? If you're Alexander the Great, you don't rest. You go on to do the impossible. In 333 BC, fresh off his stunning victory against the Persian king Darius III at the Battle of Issus, Alexander had a choice. He could chase Darius deep into the heart of Persia, or he could secure his rear flank. The Persian navy still controlled the seas, a massive threat that could cut his supply lines and even invade his homeland of Macedonia. So Alexander turned south along the Mediterranean coast. His goal: to capture every single naval base the Persians used. Most cities saw the writing on the wall and surrendered. But one city, a jewel of the Phoenician coast, refused to bow. That city was Tyre. Tyre wasn't just any city. It was an island fortress, located about half a mile offshore, surrounded by massive walls that rose straight out of the sea. The Tyrians were masters of the sea, confident that no land-based army could ever touch them. They mocked Alexander from their ramparts, convinced of their own safety. They had withstood sieges before, one lasting for 13 years. They thought Alexander would simply give up and move on. They severely underestimated his determination. Alexander announced his plan, and it was so audacious his own engineers thought he was insane. He was going to build a causeway, a land bridge, straight through the sea to the island. The work began immediately. Thousands of soldiers became construction workers, felling cedars from the mountains of Lebanon and dumping rock and timber into the water. At first, the work was easy in the shallow coastal waters. But as they pushed further out, the sea grew deeper, and the Tyrians began to fight back. From their warships, they launched arrows and projectiles at the exposed workers. From their high walls, they rained down fire and stones. It was a brutal, grueling process. To protect his men, Alexander built 2 giant wooden siege towers over 150 feet tall and mounted them at the end of the causeway. These were armed with catapults to fire back at the Tyrian ships and walls. The Tyrians responded with a stroke of genius. They took an old horse transport ship, loaded it with pitch, sulfur, and other flammable materials, and basically turned it into a giant floating bomb. On a windy day, they towed it towards the causeway, set it ablaze, and aimed it directly at Alexander's new siege towers. The fire ship slammed into the end of the mole, and the towers were engulfed in flames. At the same time, Tyrian soldiers swarmed out in small boats to attack the Macedonian workers trying to put out the fire. In a matter of hours, months of hard work had gone up in smoke. It was a catastrophe. Any other general might have admitted defeat, but this setback only fueled Alexander's resolve. He didn't just rebuild the causeway. He made it even wider to accommodate more towers and more troops. But he also realized he couldn't take Tyre without a navy of his own. So he did something remarkable. He traveled back up the coast to the cities that had already surrendered to him: Sidon, Byblos, and others. These were traditional rivals of Tyre. Alexander persuaded them to lend him their fleets. Soon Cyprus and even Rhodes joined in. Within a few months, Alexander had assembled a fleet of over 200 warships, effectively trapping the Tyrian navy in their own harbor. The siege entered its final, brutal phase, with his new fleet blockading the island. Alexander's engineers could finish the causeway. He brought up his most powerful siege engines, massive catapults that could hurl 60-pound stones, and siege towers equipped with battering rams on ships. For days they pounded the city walls. The Tyrians fought back with incredible ingenuity, using grappling hooks to snap the catapult ropes and dropping red-hot sand on the attackers, which got inside their armor and caused agonizing burns. But the relentless assault took its toll. Finally, after 7 long months, the Macedonian siege engines breached the southern wall. The final assault was merciless. Alexander himself led the charge from a siege tower. His soldiers poured through the breach, while others scaled the walls from ladders on ships. The fighting was street to street, house to house. The Tyrians, knowing there would be no mercy, fought to the last man. The bloodshed was immense. By the end of the day, the magnificent city of Tyre was a ruin. It's estimated that around 8,000 Tyrians were killed in the fighting, in a show of brutal force meant to deter any other city from defying him. Alexander had 2,000 military-aged men crucified along the coast. The remaining 30,000 citizens were sold into slavery. The impossible had been achieved. The island of Tyre was now permanently connected to the mainland, as it remains to this day. With the coast secured, Alexander marched south towards Egypt. But there was one more city in his way, Gaza. This fortress was commanded by a eunuch named Baitus, who was fiercely loyal to the Persian king. He had stockpiled supplies for a long siege and believed his position atop a high mound was impregnable. He was wrong. Alexander, employing the same siege techniques he'd perfected at Tyre, surrounded the city. During one assault, Alexander was severely wounded, struck in the shoulder by a catapult bolt that pierced his shield and armor. The wound was serious, but he recovered and pressed the attack. After 2 months, Gaza fell. The fate of its commander, Baitus, is a dark chapter in Alexander's story. Enraged by the defiance and his own injury, Alexander is said to have tied Baitus to a chariot and dragged him around the city walls while he was still alive, a cruel imitation of how Achilles treated Hector in the Iliad. Finally, the path to Egypt was clear. Unlike the defiant cities of Phoenicia, Egypt welcomed Alexander not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. For centuries, Egypt had been under the thumb of the Persian Empire, which had shown little respect for their religion and culture. Alexander, in contrast, showed profound respect. He made sacrifices to the Egyptian gods, including the sacred Apis bull. The Egyptians, in turn, were overjoyed. They didn't just accept his rule. They crowned him pharaoh, the legitimate successor to the ancient kings of Egypt. During his time in Egypt, Alexander made one of his most lasting contributions to the world. On the Mediterranean coast, at a strategic spot near the Nile Delta, he personally laid out the plans for a new city. He designed its grid-like streets, its marketplace, its walls, and designated locations for temples to both Greek and Egyptian gods. This city would be named Alexandria. It was destined to become the greatest city of the ancient world, a center of trade, culture, and learning, for 1,000 years home to the legendary Great Library and the Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But there was one more journey Alexander had to make in Egypt, a personal quest into the heart of the desert. He had heard stories of the Oracle of Siwa, a remote sanctuary dedicated to the god Ammon, whom the Greeks equated with their own king of the gods, Zeus. Getting there was a perilous 300-mile trek across the unforgiving Libyan desert. His party nearly died of thirst before being saved by a sudden rainstorm. Later, they became lost in a sandstorm, only to be guided, as legend has it, by 2 crows that led them straight to the oasis. When Alexander finally reached the oracle, he was granted a rare privilege. Unlike other visitors, he was allowed to enter the inner sanctum and consult the high priest alone. No one knows for sure what was said in that secret meeting, but when Alexander emerged, he seemed profoundly changed. According to his companions, he was pleased with the answers he received. Rumor spread like wildfire. Had the oracle confirmed his divine heritage? Had the priest addressed him as the son of Ammon or the son of Zeus? This idea that Alexander was not merely a mortal king but a demigod would become a powerful part of his legend and his political identity. It justified his conquests and elevated him above all other men. Leaving Egypt with his divine status seemingly confirmed and his rear flank completely secure, Alexander the Great turned his gaze back to the east. The Persian Empire was still vast, and King Darius was gathering a new, even larger army for one final showdown. The stage was set for the battle that would decide the fate of an empire and seal Alexandria's place in history. The the Battle of Gaugamela, but that is a story for another time. In the autumn of 331 BC, the ancient world paused. Every road, every messenger, every rumor led to a single place on the plains of Mesopotamia, near a village called Gaugamela. Here, the fate of the Persian Empire and perhaps the entire ancient world would be decided. This was not merely another battle. This was succession by violence. After the humiliation at Issus, Darius III did not flee into obscurity. He fled to prepare. This time there would be no narrow coastline, no mountains hemming in his numbers, no excuses. Darius chose the battlefield himself. The plains near Gaugamela were flattened deliberately, trees cut down, uneven ground leveled to allow Persian cavalry and scythe chariots to operate freely. Arrian records, Darius left nothing to chance, believing the open plain would favor his multitude. This was Persia's final gamble. The Persian war machine Darius assembled the greatest force the empire could muster. Modern historians reject ancient exaggerations, but still estimate several 100,000 troops of force unmatched in Alexander's experience. The army included Persian infantry and cavalry allied contingents from across the empire, scythe chariots designed to tear through infantry war elephants, terrifying to untrained soldiers, the immortals and royal guards. This was not merely an army, it was the empire in motion. Historian Pierre Bryant describes it as the final assertion of Achaemenid imperial authority. Alexander's army, outnumbered, unshaken, Alexander marched toward Gaugamela with approximately 47,000 men. They were veterans. They had survived sieges, deserts, and impossible odds. They trusted their king not as a distant ruler, but as a man who bled beside them. When scouts reported Persian numbers, fear spread. Alexander responded with preparation, not speeches. He personally inspected the terrain. He adjusted formations. He planned contingencies. Plutarch notes, Alexander slept peacefully the night before the battle. Parmenion did not. Parmenion urged a night assault. The logic was sound. Surprise could compensate for numbers. Alexander refused. His reply, recorded by multiple sources, became legend. I will not steal victory. This was not bravado. Alexander wanted a visible, undeniable triumph. He understood something fundamental. Fear spreads faster than defeat. Dawn at Gaugamela at sunrise. The two armies faced each other. Darius stood at the center, elevated on a royal chariot, surrounded by elite guards. His presence was meant to anchor the army. Alexander positioned himself on the right wing, leading the companion cavalry. This choice was deliberate. The right wing was the point of decision. The Persian chariots charged first, blades spun, horses thundered. Alexander had anticipated this. Macedonian troops opened lanes, allowing chariots to pass through before striking them from the sides. The Persian advantage evaporated instantly. Arrian writes, the devices meant to destroy instead became useless. But the battle was far from over. Persian cavalry pressed hard against the Macedonian left. For a moment, Alexander's army bent dangerously. Then Alexander acted. Rather than reinforce the collapsing left, Alexander did something unexpected. He advanced diagonally to the right, stretching Persian lines, forcing gaps to appear. When the opening came, Alexander struck. He led a wedge formation directly toward Darius, not toward the army, toward the king. This maneuver was extraordinarily risky. If Alexander failed, the battle would collapse instantly. Historian Peter Green emphasizes, Alexander's strategy depended entirely on his own survival. The charge cut through Persian ranks. Bodies fell, horses screamed, the distance closed, and once again Darius broke. Seeing Alexander approaching, Darius turned his chariot and fled, not strategically, psychologically. The great king fled before physical contact was made. Arrian records the moment with quiet finality. When Darius fled, all hope fled with him. The Persian center collapsed. The empire collapsed with it. Even as Darius fled, danger remained. On Alexander's left, Persian cavalry broke through and attacked the Macedonian camp. Alexander faced a choice: pursue Darius and end the war immediately, or turn back and save his army. He chose the army. This decision matters. It reveals that despite divine imagery, Alexander still ruled as a general, not a god. Once Alexander returned, Persian resistance disintegrated. What followed was not battle, it was disintegration. Ancient sources describe chaos, slaughter, and flight across the plains. The empire that had ruled the Near East for over 200 years ceased to exist in a single day. After Gaugamela, something unprecedented occurred. There was no Persian counteroffensive, no rallying king, no second army. Darius fled east, no longer as ruler but fugitive. Historian Paul Cartledge writes, Gaugamela ended the Achaemenid Empire even before Darius died. Alexander had not just defeated Persia, he had replaced it. Alexander marched into Babylon, then Susa, then Persepolis. Cities opened their gates. Treasuries spilled gold beyond counting. At Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persian power, Alexander stood inside palaces built to symbolize eternity. And then he burned them. Ancient sources debate why. Perhaps all three. Flames consumed the palaces of Xerxes. According to Diodorus, the fire marked the end of Persian rule. It was not just destruction, it was closure. Darius was still alive. The empire was gone. Alexander now ruled more territory than any man before him, but conquest had not ended, it had only changed direction. The next chapter begins when Alexander hunts the last Persian king and discovers that victory brings a darker kind of enemy. After Gaugamela, the Persian Empire no longer resisted. It dissolved, cities surrendered without battle, governors opened treasuries, satraps pledged loyalty. What Alexander had destroyed was not an army, but a belief, the belief that Persia could defend itself. Yet one figure still lived. Darius III, the great king, was alive, fleeing eastward through Media toward Bactria. As long as Darius breathed, Alexander was not king, he was only a conqueror. Alexander did not celebrate, he hunted, he moved faster than ever, forcing his exhausted army across deserts and mountains. Supplies ran low, horses collapsed, men fell behind and died. Why chase a defeated enemy? Because legitimacy mattered in Persian tradition, kingship was sacred. Alexander understood this now. He could not simply take the throne by conquest, he had to inherit it or eliminate its last claimant. Historian Pierre Bryant explains, Alexander was no longer fighting Persia. He was competing for Persian kingship. This was no longer a Greek war, it was a Persian succession crisis. Darius fled with a reduced entourage, nobles, guards, and satraps who no longer believed in him. Among them was Bessus, satrap of Bactria. As Alexander closed in, loyalty fractured. Ancient sources describe Darius being seized by his own men, stripped of royal insignia, and carried in chains. Curtius Rufus writes, the great king was now a prisoner of those who once bowed before him. Power had completely inverted when Alexander's scouts neared. Bessus made his choice. Darius was stabbed and left to die beside the road. By the time Alexander arrived, the King of Kings lay dying in a cart, bleeding into the dust. Arrian records, Alexander covered the body with his cloak and wept. Whether grief or performance, the symbolism was precise. Alexander buried Darius with full royal honors, condemning his murderers as traitors. This moment was critical. Alexander did not claim to have defeated Darius. He claimed to have avenged him. With Darius dead, Alexander's war officially ended, but his rule had just begun. He adopted Persian court customs. He wore Persian dress. He retained Persian administrators. He demanded loyalty not as a foreign general but as great king. To his Macedonian companions, this was unsettling. To the Persians, it was reassuring. Historian Paul Cartledge notes, Alexander was now ruling Persia as Persians expected to be ruled. This was not cultural curiosity, it was political necessity. Not everyone accepted Alexander's claim. Bessus declared himself king under the name Artaxerxes V and retreated east. Alexander pursued him relentlessly across Central Asia. These were not glorious campaigns. They were brutal counter-insurgencies fought in deserts, mountains, and hostile territory. Villages were destroyed. Rebels were crucified. Entire regions were pacified through terror. Arrian describes the tone shift. The war was no longer against armies, but against defiance itself. Alexander was no longer liberating, he was enforcing. As Alexander pressed east, he attempted something unprecedented. He sought to merge Macedonian and Persian elites. He recruited Persians into his army. He married Persian nobility. Into his court, he demanded proskynesis ritual bowing from Greeks. This caused outrage. To Greeks, proskynesis was reserved for gods, not men. Alexander insisted. This was not arrogance, it was imperial logic. An empire of many peoples required a single center of reverence. Unfortunately, that center was now Alexander himself. Resistance turned fatal. Callisthenes, Alexander's court historian and nephew of Aristotle, openly criticized the king's adoption of Persian customs. Soon after, a conspiracy among royal pages was uncovered. Callisthenes was implicated. He was imprisoned. He died in captivity. Ancient sources differ on the details, but agree on the significance. Plutarch writes, "From this moment, Alexander ceased to tolerate free speech. This was a turning point. The philosopher king gave way to the absolute ruler. Alexander now ruled an empire that stretched from Greece to Central Asia. But he trusted fewer people than ever. Old companions felt alienated. Persians were never fully trusted. Paranoia grew. He drank heavily. He punished severely. He demanded loyalty not just in action but in belief." Historian Peter Green concludes, "Alexander conquered the world but lost the companionship that once anchored him. The king who could not stop by 327 BC, Alexander had achieved what no one before him had. Yet he did not stop. He crossed into India not for necessity, not for revenge, but for completion. To reach the edge of the world, to surpass all predecessors, to prove once and for all that there were no limits. With Darius dead, Alexander stood uncontested. There was no enemy equal to him. Only exhaustion, resistance, and the growing question of whether conquest itself had become addiction. The conqueror had replaced the king. But the cost was becoming unbearable. Beyond the mountains lay India unknown, immense and unconquered. Alexander would face armies larger than any before, and for the first time. His own men would begin to say no. The next chapter begins at the edge of the known world, where Alexander meets resistance not from enemies but from his own army. By 327 BC, Alexander had crossed farther east than any Greek or Persian army in history. The lands ahead were not Persia. They were India, a place of legend, myth, and terror to the ancient Mediterranean world. Greek maps ended here. Stories took over, gold guarding ants, giant serpents, cities of unimaginable wealth, rivers. So vast they were believed to flow from the edge of the world. Alexander did not see mystery, he saw destiny. There can be no boundary to conquest for a king who believes himself chosen by fate. Arrian India was not a strategic necessity. Persia was already conquered. The treasury was full, the army was exhausted, but Alexander believed something deeper. He believed the world had edges and that he had to reach them. Aristotle had taught him that the known world was finite. Alexander intended to verify it personally. Modern historian Robin Lane Fox explains, India was not about empire, it was about completion. Completion of what? His legend, India, was unlike anything Alexander had faced. Dense forests replaced open plains. Rivers were wider than any in Persia. Monsoon rains turned roads into swamps. Worst of all were elephants. Alexander's cavalry dominance was suddenly meaningless. The Macedonians were afraid. They did not hide it. The most powerful Indian ruler in Alexander's path was King Porus, who ruled the region beyond the Hydaspes River. Porus did not flee. He prepared at the riverbank. He positioned infantry, cavalry, and elephants, towering, armored, terrifying. Arrian describes the moment. The elephants stood like moving fortresses, unknown to the Macedonians and dreadful to behold. Alexander did what he always did. He adapted under cover of storm and darkness. Alexander crossed the river upstream. It was one of the most dangerous maneuvers of his career. When battle was joined, chaos ruled. Horses panicked at the elephants. Infantry was crushed beneath massive feet. Men were lifted and thrown. Yet slowly, methodically, Alexander dismantled Porus' army. When Porus was wounded and captured, Alexander asked how he wished to be treated. Porus replied, "Like a king." Alexander restored him to power. This was not mercy, it was strategy. Hydaspes was a victory, but it felt different. Casualties were heavy. Veterans were dying far from home. The climate was brutal. The wars no longer felt meaningful. For the first time, Alexander sensed something dangerous, not fear. Fatigue. Alexander wanted more. He marched east toward the Ganges River, believing it to be the final boundary. But his soldiers learned something horrifying. Beyond the Ganges lay vast empires, with armies larger than anything they had faced, tens of thousands of infantry, thousands of elephants. The men refused to go further. The mutiny at the Hyphasis River at the Hyphasis River, the army stopped, not quietly, openly. Veterans wept, officers pleaded, soldiers refused orders. They had been campaigning for 8 years. They were thousands of miles from home. They had seen every friend die. Arrian records their words. "We beg you, Alexander, let us return. There will be other men to conquer the world, but none left here." Alexander locked himself in his tent for 3 days. He raged, he prayed, he threatened. Nothing worked. For the first time in his life, Alexander was disobeyed. Alexander emerged and gave the order to turn back. He claimed it was his decision. No one believed it. This was the only battle he ever lost, and it was without bloodshed. Historian Peter Green writes, "The refusal at the Hyphasis marked the end of Alexander's dream of infinite conquest. The world had no edge, but his army did. The return was worse than the advance." Alexander led his army through the Gedrosian Desert, one of the most lethal regions on earth. Heat, thirst, starvation, entire units vanished. Ancient sources claim up to 3/4 of the army died. Alexander marched with them. He refused water if his men had none. Whether leadership or guilt, history cannot say. When Alexander reached Babylon in 325 BC, he was not the same. He drank heavily. He grew suspicious. He punished dissent brutally. He spoke increasingly of divinity. The conqueror who once led from the front now ruled from above. Alone, India marked the limit not of Alexander's power but of human endurance. He had conquered the world as he knew it, but he had not conquered himself. The empire was vast, its foundations were thin, and the man holding it together was burning out. Alexander returned. West victorious but hollow. Within 2 years he would be dead, no heir prepared, no system secured, and an empire held together by one man would soon tear itself apart. The next chapter begins in Babylon, where the greatest conqueror in history faces his final enemy, mortality. Babylon stood at the heart of Alexander's empire, ancient, immense, sacred. Its walls were legendary, its temples older than Greece itself. Its position between East and West made it the perfect capital for a world empire. Alexander chose Babylon deliberately, not as a conqueror passing through, but as a ruler settling in. Arrian records, he intended Babylon to be the seat of his empire, from which he would govern all lands. For the first time in his life, Alexander planned peace, and that is when death arrived. Context bridge. The weight of a world by 325 BC, Alexander ruled more territory than any man before him. But the empire was fragile. Satraps ruled distant provinces with autonomy. Generals controlled armies loyal more to commanders than to institutions. Macedonians resented Persian influence. Persians distrusted Macedonian dominance. And Alexander stood alone at the center, overworked, exhausted, increasingly isolated. Modern historian Adrian Goldsworthy notes, Alexander had created an empire faster than any system could be built to sustain it. He was holding it together by willpower, and willpower was running out. The king in decline in Babylon, Alexander resumed heavy drinking. Ancient sources describe days-long feasts, competitive drinking, rituals, and escalating excess. At one banquet, after honoring his admiral Nearchus, Alexander reportedly drank an enormous cup of unmixed wine. Soon after, he collapsed with a fever. Plutarch writes, he was seized by a pain in the back, as though struck by a spear. What followed was 2 weeks of agony. The illness, mystery, and debate Alexander's symptoms were severe, high fever, weakness, loss of speech. Gradual paralysis, ancient writers debated the cause. Some accused poisoning, possibly by Antipater's family. Others described natural illness, malaria, typhoid, pancreatitis, or complications from alcohol. Modern medical historians lean toward typhoid fever, worsened by exhaustion and drinking. But the truth remains unknowable. What matters is not how Alexander died, but how unprepared the empire was for it. Mid-video pattern interrupt. The silent king as Alexander lay dying. His generals gathered outside his chamber. The army demanded to see him. He could not speak. He nodded. They filed past in silence. Veterans who had crossed continents with him wept openly. Arrian records. There was no lamentation more terrible than the silence of those who knew he was gone. This was not the death of a man. It was the collapse of certainty. The fatal question as his condition worsened. Alexander was asked the question that would haunt history. To whom do you leave the empire? Ancient sources differ. Some claim he whispered, to the strongest. Others say he handed his signet ring to Perdiccas, commander of the companion cavalry. Either way, the result was the same. There was no clear successor, no heir of age, no constitutional mechanism. The greatest empire on earth was inherited by ambiguity. Death of the conqueror Alexander died in June 323 BC. He was 32 years old. He had ruled for just over a decade. Yet in that time, he had reshaped the world. Plutarch writes, he left no equal, no successor, and no limit to the admiration of men. The body did not decay for days, a detail later used to suggest divinity. But the empire began decaying immediately. Aftermath. The wars of the Diadochi. Alexander's generals, known as the Diadochi, initially claimed unity. It was a lie. Within months, alliances shattered. Civil war consumed the empire for decades. Ptolemy took Egypt. Seleucus claimed Asia. Antigonus sought supremacy. Cassander seized Macedonia. Alexander's wife Roxana and his son Alexander IV were murdered. His brother Philip III Aridaeus was executed. By 281 BC, the empire was permanently divided. Historian Robin Lane Fox summarizes, Alexander's empire died because it was designed to die with him. The shattered dream, what Alexander had built, was extraordinary but personal. There were no institutions strong enough to replace him, no shared ideology, no accepted succession, just generals with armies. The unity he envisioned, Greek and Persian, East and West, fractured almost instantly. Yet something remained, legacy. A world permanently changed. Alexander's conquests created the Hellenistic world. Greek language spread from Egypt to India. Cities like Alexandria became centers of learning, science, and culture. Trade routes expanded, ideas traveled. Even Rome would inherit a world shaped by Alexander. Historian Peter Green writes, Alexander failed as a ruler, but succeeded as a force of history. His empire died. His influence did not. Final reflection. The man and the myth. Alexander sought immortality through conquest. He did not find it in empire. He found it in memory. His life became legend before it became history. A boy who chased glory, a king who reached the edge of the world. A man who conquered everything except time. Final endpoint, closed loop resolution. The story ends where it began, with a young man who believed destiny had chosen him, and a world that would never be the same again. Alexander did not rule forever, but the world he created never returned to what it was.